Welcome, everybody, to the AVERT Research Network's combined hybrid seminar webinar. We are absolutely delighted to have with us today Associate Professor David Malet from American University in Washington, D.C. And it's a great pleasure to have David back with us in Melbourne. He has sojourned previously, as I'll tell you in a moment. David is going to be speaking to us today on Ukraine foreign fighters, volunteers on the right side, or the far right's ISIS or Islamic State. David, and I won't go through the abstract because David is going to unspool that in his presentation, but David, as I've said, is an associate professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University in Washington, D.C. He was previously the director of the Security Policy Studies program at George Washington University. He also taught at the University of Melbourne, which is where we got to know each other, and at Colorado State University, where he was director of the Center for the Study of Homeland Security. And in an earlier part of the 2000s, he served as a research assistant on national security issues for the US Senate Majority Leader, Tom Daschle, which seems like a very long time ago now, I have to say. David has been researching foreign fighters since 2005. He is the author of the book Foreign Fighters, Transnational Identity in Civil Conflicts, and co-editor of Transnational Actors in War and Peace, Militants, Activists, and Corporations in World Politics. And of course, he regularly consults on foreign terrorist fighter policy challenges for both governmental and civil society organizations and media. And he has some side interests in the military use of biotechnologies and the use of counter-narratives in radicalization. So would you please join me in giving David a very warm welcome? Now, just before David gets started with his talk, a couple of housekeeping rules. So David is going to speak for about 35 or 40 minutes. There will certainly be time for Q&A and engagement with David's work following that. We will have people, and we do have people online who are streaming the webinar. So for those of you who are online, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens if you would like to post questions, and we will moderate those questions as they come through. Of course, if you've joined us here in the room, all you have to do is raise your hand to speak. So with that, David, welcome. And everybody turn your phones off if you wouldn't mind. At least put them on silent.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I'm grateful to you, to the AVERT Network, and to Deakin University for hosting me today. I'm really glad to see some familiar faces in the room and online as well. And I'm happy to be back in Melbourne, as you mentioned. I first came here around this time of year in 2012, and that was just before two things happened. The first was that, of course, that hundreds of Australians attempted to join the Islamic State. And then the second was, far less consequential, was that my book, based on my doctoral dissertation research on foreign fighter radicalization and recruitment, was published, just after that. So I spent a lot of time talking about people going off to ISIS and what would happen when they returned based on the data from past cases. And my conclusion then was that ISIS was a major threat, but that individual returnees probably weren't. So I'm going to give you a similarly mixed message today about volunteers to Ukraine. And to answer the question posed in my presentation title, most are volunteers for what large majorities in Western countries would call the right side, unquote, in the Ukraine conflict. And for a variety of reasons that I'll explain, few are likely to be threats upon return. But they're also, and actually I'll start with my slides with that. Again, just as I've talked, this is not an abstract academic question. There are certainly a number of Australians who've gone off to the Ukraine conflict, already. In the former category, and you're from here in Melbourne, in the former category, I think there's a celebration of a lot of them, including some who've given their lives as defending citizens of Ukraine, against Russian invasion. But there's also the concern about the other ones. And so, as I mentioned, this is probably what most people would think of, but there's also probably what most of you in the room today and online are concerned about. Which is the other foreign fighters there. There are indeed extremists connected to global networks who have gone to Ukraine specifically for training, in the case of this individual, who I'll say more about in a second. And some have already returned in the US and here in Australia, and they've done what handfuls of returnees historically do. They become leaders and recruiters for extremist networks, and some have engaged in political violence and domestic terror plots already. So let's take a look at what we're seeing. Actually, I'll get back to this guy in a second. But I mean, this more recent case, right? This is Daniel Newman from Sydney, who slipped out, again, with the express intention of getting training in Ukraine to bring back, at home. The previous stories, actually, as you can see, is from a few years ago. I was interviewed for this article. This is Ethan Tilling, who was a former soldier in the Defense Force, who was discharged early after 18 months, couldn't continue to serve. And this is actually something we've seen with people who've joined other groups like the YPG fighting against ISIS. A lot of them have had military less than honorable discharges, wanted to keep fighting and couldn't. The same case here. He'd gotten involved in some anti-Islamic groups and was unable to go fight ISIS directly. So he started looking for other causes he could join. And he was able to finally go off after being involved domestically in this group known as right-wing resistance. He was able to go off to Ukraine. In some of his interviews, he talked about some white supremacist tropes that you hear about. A young man can only prove himself through fighting, and he was basically looking for a venue to do that. He went to Ukraine and he joined an outfit of foreign fighters called the Georgian Legion, about which I'll say more momentarily. There's definitely still in the news. So, again, the concern is what do these guys do when they come back? Is it a valid comparison to say that these neo-Nazi white supremacist groups or other far-right groups are something like ISIS? Some of them use that rhetoric themselves, and some of them described Ukraine as basically being their opportunity to have something like a caliphate where they can get mass numbers, or go back to Afghanistan in the 1980s to develop these networks and engage in plots subsequent to that. So, I'm going to talk a little bit. I actually had a chance to go to a conference in Oslo a couple months ago, hosted by somebody who's been researching these guys specifically and talking to a lot of them directly since 2014. So I'd like to share a little bit about what I've learned about this in the last few months, as well as what we know about foreign fighters generally, both ISIS and previous cases that we have. If you look at other cases, which I'll argue are actually pretty comparable, surprisingly comparable, we actually have decades or centuries and hundreds of thousands of data points we can compare about what to look for with Ukrainian volunteers and returnees. And fortunately, we're having a lot of new studies in the past few years telling us about what foreign fighters actually do when they're over there as well. That's something that I think was lacking before. So what I want to talk about today is, how, in what ways is Ukraine like other cases like the Islamic State, or what ways is it different? To do that, I'm not going to go into too much, academic, sort of hopefully academic jargon today. But it is important to have definitions of actually, who are we talking about when we look at foreign fighters? Who counts in the picture? Is it everybody who's going off to Ukraine? Do they have to be on the front lines to be a fighter? That was a question that came up with ISIS as well. This term foreign terrorist fighter that's been used a lot, FTF. What exactly is that? Do they count in that category? So I'll talk a little bit about the scope of who we're talking about in a minute. Look at the data that we have about that's the Spanish Civil War volunteers in the 1930s on top. What do they do? What does the research tell us about what foreign fighters actually do? How are they recruited? What do they do when they're over there? What can we expect to be happening with people who've gone off to Ukraine, even if they weren't part of some of these networks? We have data that shows us that there's a lot of foreign fighters do become radicalized when they're abroad. And then, what do they do when they come back? Very importantly as well. And then, what are we seeing right now in Ukraine with the volunteers who are over there? So just really briefly, big picture stuff. And this is my data from the doctoral dissertation. Basically, a foreign fighter, it's a term that I wasn't really expecting to not have been fleshed out when I was doing my doctoral work, but it hadn't been. So my definition, which gets cited a lot, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it doesn't totally apply in the Ukraine case. But most of the academic research on foreign fighters looks at people who are fighting with rebel groups, non-state groups, insurgencies, the rebel side in the civil war. And that's consequential because if you think about Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan in the 2000s, these were people who didn't have legal rights as combatants, right? They invented this term, unlawful enemy combatant, specifically because they didn't want to give those people rights under the Geneva Convention as prisoners of war. So they invented this category, unlawful enemy combatants, so they could ship them off to places like Guantanamo. It's a very different prospect than going off and joining, let's say, the French Foreign Legion, where you have rights, you have government representation, you're probably more likely to win and survive, right? If you join a rebel group, well, usually they lose, right? They're usually the weaker side. There's no guarantee you're going to get paid, even if you do survive. You don't, if you're joining, there's nowhere in the world where it's legal to rise up in arms against the government. So if you join a group like that, you have no protection anywhere. How do you get people to do that? But yet we see that groups actually, for the last couple hundred years, have actually been very successful at doing that. The cases of insurgencies that we're able to find data on, we can find at least a quarter of them have had foreign fighters as volunteers. A little different than most of the people in Ukraine, and I'll talk right now who we're seeing in the news, and I'll talk about them in a minute. The term FTF, foreign terrorist fighter, which we've used to talk about people going off to join an Islamic State, was really only created less than a decade ago. And it's a very limited term. The UN Security Council created this term specifically and only to refer to people joining either Islamic State or Al-Qaeda affiliates, right? UN Security Council Resolution 2178, and there were one or two follow-up resolutions since then, basically made it required every member state of the United Nations to prevent their citizens from traveling to go off to join one of these groups, and importantly and controversially, to repatriate them and prosecute them once they return. So the question, should we allow returnees back? Well, under the very law creating, or international agreement creating foreign terrorist fighters, every country is supposed to repatriate them. A lot of them find reasons not to. And again, I think that's been a source of controversy for a number of years. But there were cases, I think he was a French national who was prosecuted after returning from Syria, and his lawyer successfully argued, well, he's not a foreign terrorist fighter because he was with some other jihadi group, not ISIS or Al-Qaeda affiliate, so he wouldn't count as an FTF, and the court had to let him go under the circumstances because the law didn't apply to him. So there's no, the term terrorist is sort of almost immaterial in this case to what they're actually doing. It's just, it's a legal term referring to what countries have to do for their citizens who join ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Doesn't apply to anybody joining Ukraine, regardless of what kind of extremist group they may or may not be part of. And big picture, the jihadis have been what we've all been focusing on for a number of years, but they're really historically, and even today, there are a number of groups out there of foreign fighters. They're still only about half, right? They're growing in absolute numbers, but there's so many other causes. And Ukraine obviously has been in the news and has had some numbers, although perhaps not as big as media reports indicate. But it's not alone. There's certainly a number of other cases out there right now as well, which we can talk about if you're interested. All right, so if there are these very specific definitions of foreign fighters, who counts? How many foreign fighters are there in Ukraine? Which ones? And of all these people going off to fight on the Ukrainian side that we've talked about, technically none of them are foreign fighters, right? Because they didn't join an insurgency. They're joining either the Ukrainian army, right, as part of its foreign legion essentially today, or the ones who went pre the Russian invasion in 2022, when Russian forces were occupying eastern Ukraine since 2014. They're still going off and fighting on behalf of the Ukrainian government, and they were welcomed there. It's definitely not the same thing as joining an Al-Qaeda affiliate. So technically, by that definition, there were no foreign fighters, or certainly no foreign terrorist fighters. In terms of foreign volunteers, Kasper, my friend Kasper Rekovic, who's Polish, but he's working at the University of Oslo right now for CREX, Center for Research on Extremism. He actually just came out with a book, which I would recommend, called Foreign Fighters in Ukraine. Came out last December. Kasper's numbers were probably about 5,000 foreign volunteers before the Russian invasion last year on the pro-Ukraine side. Most of them are at this point are in the official Foreign Legion of the Ukraine Army, but not all of them, as we'll talk about. And the ones who probably bear watching as extremists are not being welcomed into the Ukraine Foreign Legion, so that they're finding other groups to join. So they're not technically foreign fighters, but from what we've seen of the ones who've gone and the ones who've come back, they're actually behaving a lot like the ones that we would define as foreign fighters. So I'm just going to ignore these academic technical definitions basically for the rest of my talk. On the Russian side, there have been far more of them pre the big invasion last year. And you hear these media reports about so-called little green men, which were basically Russian military personnel who are not wearing their insignia, who are coming in and joining the separatist groups in Donbass and elsewhere. That's not what most of them were. According to Kasper's field research, most of them were actually individual Russians who were signing up for non-governmental organizations, basically Russian charities, saying, "Go help out in Donbass, and by the way, you're going to have to shoot back because the Ukrainian Nazis are trying to kill Russians." So that's what most of them were. They signed up, they had very small monetary rewards, but they're being brought in by probably government sponsored, but not directly government affiliated organizations in Russia recruiting them. There are a couple of other types of foreign fighters. Again, I would call them foreign fighters because they were on the rebel side, the separatist side, in the Civil War phase of things. You had people join some of the local armed groups. So you had some separatist local governments, Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic. These were the local groups that declared themselves to be either independent states or part of Russia, and some individual volunteers did go join them. There were also groups that organized in European countries specifically to go off and fight on the Russian side for the liberation of, as they saw it, of eastern Ukraine away from the state of Ukraine. So one of them, Orthodox Dawn, there were some Serbian groups as well, and they were anti-West, or some of them were pro, as they saw it, Slavic identity, which is a little bit hard because both sides are Slavic in this, but pro-Russian. So there were people, there was a mix of people who joined local groups and external foreign fighter groups who came in and set up shop there, kind of like an ISIS model. One thing I haven't seen any good data on, and I've asked people who have been following this, Ukraine closely for a number of years, and they don't know either. But something to consider also is, the number of Ukrainians abroad going and off to Ukraine, returning there to fight, and perhaps coming back to countries where they have work visas. I haven't seen any data on those types of returnees, but I mean that could be a concern as well. One thing to note from the 2014 to 2022 data is you did have, and I'll talk about more about this in a minute, but you did have total ideological inconsistency. So if you're worried particularly about far right or extremist networks, they were on the Ukraine side, but they were also on the Russian side, including from here in Australia. You saw one pro-Ukrainian neo-Nazi volunteer. I'll talk about another one on the Ukrainian side in a minute, who went in the 2010s. But Casper's book, about foreign fighters in Ukraine, its subtitle is "The Red-Brown Cocktail," because he found a lot of these units where guys were fighting together. There were extreme, Marxists and Nazis like on the same side, who were basically just there for a fight, just there for the adventure. Didn't really have clear political views, or very confusing political views at least. So among these potential diaspora volunteers who would have gone and perhaps might return, it's not really clear that they are on one side of the conflict, and it's not really clear that they would have one ideological bent, either far right, far left, or something else. So it's not just as simple as far right networks either. In terms of the numbers we're looking at, if we say there were about 19,000 before 2022 who went, that puts us sort of in the middle of the largest foreign fighter mobilizations historically. Islamic State doesn't even get a medal in the foreign fighter Olympics. It's really been Marxist groups in the 20th century that have organized the biggest ones. And yeah, things like social media matter, but I'll give you a couple of examples. Groups always use whatever popular media is available at the time, whatever communications technologies are available at the time, and they can get tens of thousands of people with no internet service whatsoever because it didn't exist yet for these cases. So right now, we're sort of in the middle range when it comes to big foreign fighter mobilizations. Again, as I mentioned before, there's been a trend of growing numbers. So you could say globalization, something to do with it. The red lines are every civil war up until the middle of the 2010s in the last couple hundred years. So a big spike in the number of civil wars after World War II, post decolonization, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of independent states. And then the blue lines in front are the ones that we know had foreign fighters, and those have been on the upsurge as well. And what we're seeing from a lot of groups is that they tend to copy each other. They're aware of other foreign fighter groups, and they self-consciously say, if they did it, we can do it too. And you see this in Ukraine. Well, if the jihadis can do it, then we can bring people in as well. And so they actually look for patterns and what worked for them, how did they recruit, and try to copy it as best as they can. How they get them is an interesting story, right? And it's actually surprisingly consistent, but it doesn't matter, which of those bars it was, which decade, what the cause was, where in the world it happened. We actually see foreign fighter groups recruit people, radicalize them perhaps, through the same set of processes. And if you think about it, mostly these insurgent groups, like I said, they're usually not the winners in civil wars. They start out materially poor. They don't have legal recognition. They're not getting mercenaries for the most part. They can't afford to pay mercenaries, right? So how do they get people to join usually the weaker side in the civil war? with no firm guarantees about what will happen to them when it turns out. You see, because these rebel groups are the weaker side, they try to, they look to expand the scope of the conflict. Who's involved? Sometimes they can get support from foreign governments, but sometimes they can't. And so they'll look for other people who have a vested interest in the conflict because they identify with the rebel groups. Oftentimes they're members of a religious or an ethnic or an ideological group that has some sort of ties to the rebels fighting. And so the people that they target, the ones who they recruit to try to become foreign fighters, are people who are already active typically in the organizations. So they see themselves as identifying with the cause. They've probably have heard about it through sources other than mainstream news media. They'll have some greater awareness of it. And they congregate in places, whether it's religious institutions or ethnic associations or sometimes in the Spanish Civil War case in the 1930s, workers' unions. They have physical audiences of people who are ready-made to be spoken to about. And they go to these groups and they tell them, forget your citizenship. And oftentimes they're talking to people who are part of marginalized groups. So it's easy for them to buy that argument. They say, forget your citizenship. You're part of X group, whether it's, again, an ethnic diaspora or a religious group, some ideological group. Your people are when what you're being told is some distant conflict, are under existential threat. They're coming to wipe us all out. There's a lot of atrocity language, I'll give you an example of in a second. And it's your duty as a member of the group to come help out, right? You owe it to your people because your government isn't doing anything about it. So it's on you to do something to save your people. And it's in your self-interest to do it now because they'll wipe us out and they'll come for you next. And we do see this rhetoric reflected in Ukraine, actually on both sides. We see this rhetoric reflected that on some of the pro-Russia volunteers that the West is going to come and dominate everything, or we see that Russia is going to come and destroy European civilization. We see it from some of the neo-Nazis that they're fighting back, whichever side they're on behalf of white civilization against some corrupting force. So it's very malleable, right? And we've seen historically groups shift their message about actually who's being threatened. They sell it to a new group and they're not getting what they want out of it. I think we're seeing a little bit in Ukraine. I want to give you one quick historical example, which will take far too long to explain if I go into it. But if you know the story of the Alamo, right? Remember the Alamo, or if you at least have heard the name, rental car company. This was a battle in the Texas Revolution for independence from Mexico in the 1830s. And a little known fact, the Alamo had you can think of it as almost like the Mariupol, the Azov steelworks, where you had these foreign defenders hanging out, fighting off the Russian army for weeks and refusing to leave. Battle of the Alamo is like that too. You had about 200 rebels standing off against 20,000 Mexican soldiers. They were ultimately all killed. And what's little known is only about 10 of them were actually from Texas. Like the rest had all come from the US or from Europe in the preceding weeks. So there were a few thousand foreign volunteers fighting in this war, which was basically the Mexican state at the time of Texas trying to break away from Mexico. And originally the rebels said, okay, we're Mexican citizens here, but we believe in democracy and we're fighting against military dictatorships. We want people living in the US who also had a successful revolution to come join us in the name of liberal democracy. And they didn't get a lot of volunteers that way. They didn't get a lot of takers. So they shifted the messaging to say, all right, this is actually a case of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants being attacked by Hispanic Catholics, and they're coming for white women, and somebody needs to defend their honor. And they actually got a lot more takers. They got thousands of volunteers that way. So this broadsheet, which I actually got at the Alamo at one point, it sort of gives an example from the 1830s of this sort of messaging, right? And you see some of this language. There's always atrocity language, usually very gendered. To young men, they have to defend the honor of women. Even at the time, it was illegal to recruit foreign fighters in the U.S. even in the 1830s. So they're offering farmland, and of course, you want to become a farmer in a war zone. Who wouldn't? But down in the fine print, there's still some of this language of solidarity with liberals and Zacatecas state being led away in irons elsewhere, by this military dictatorship. And the reason I'm going on about this poster so long, the reason I like to show it is because I think it lays out the logic of foreign fighter recruitment in a way that is seen in another poster also from a totally different conflict, different circumstances 150 years later. So making the same argument with the bullet points in the exact same order as the last poster, except in this case, all too true. You see this language about there are atrocities happening. Someone needs to save innocent women from war crimes. Governments aren't doing it. You have to do it. It's on you. Some nod, wink, wink language about if you want to provide more than just charitable donations, let us know. And the same transnational solidarity message as a closer at the bottom. And that's the logic that drives every foreign fighter recruitment pitch. That even if they're winning, they say they're losing. That somebody has to help out. Why? Because they make the threat big enough that you have to join before it's too late. Not come and get rich. Not kind of come and if we win independence, you'll get land out of it. They don't say too much of that. It's always this message of threat. They're not looking for mercenaries. They're looking for people who believe that they can make a difference and that they're the good guys in the narrative, and usually coming to help people out. And we've seen cases, including in Ukraine, where people have turned around and said, this isn't, they told me that there was this dire threat. I was here to save civilians. I'm not doing any of that. I'm going home. Sometimes. It seems to work, right? I mentioned most of the time rebel groups don't make out very well. They only win in this set of data about a quarter of the time. That's pretty consistent with what we know about civil wars. And the groups that have foreign fighters do a little bit better. They still don't win most of the time, but they lose less often. They might fight to more stalemates. It seems like insurgencies that recruit foreign fighters do a lot better. And in some cases, I think we can chalk it up to the individual volunteers coming in with the skills that they have that locals didn't have. In other cases, it might just be that the groups that are well organized enough to recruit transnationally are just in a better position to win anyway. So I can't say it's exclusively due to the foreign fighters. But what we have seen, and what we've seen with ISIS as well, is that some of the foreign fighters go on to become what we call career foreign fighters, kind of like career foreign service. They go on to join other rebel groups, and they take what they've learned with them. Typically, it's not a very good career move to become a foreign fighter. Most of them do pretty badly, right? They've had, I put it as an average, both for ISIS, for the Spanish Civil War, pretty consistently, about a third of them get killed on the battlefield. They tend to be treated as local rebel commanders as cannon fodder. Sometimes they're told expressly, show our boys how it's done, you go first. And they're sent out without good training or good equipment. We find that they're often very disillusioned. They end up in conflict with the civilians are ostensibly there to protect. They end up in everything from bar fights to firefights with the local rebels that they're supposedly there fighting on, to help out. And that seems to happen in pretty much every case. If you go back through the historical records, I don't think anybody was looking for it before the 2010s. I've looked for combat fatigue and shell shock and older names. I haven't found it. But from what we were seeing, with people coming back from Syria, and what we know about this sort of high, meat grinder, high conflict rate with other past volunteers, it seems like severe PTSD is a pretty common factor from what we're seeing. A lot of them, and some of them stay loyal for decades, and become activists, and I'll talk about them in a second. But a lot of them come back really disillusioned. And I can find you memoirs from that Texas war 200 years ago, where people are coming back writing tell-all memoirs about how badly they were treated, as volunteers in Texas. So few of them actually stay behind, even when they win. There was one guy who wrote a memoir of being a foreign volunteer in the Israeli War of Independence who, Israel, they won. And they were offering people, financial incentives and help you start a business. We'll give you language training. Fewer than 10%, of the volunteers actually stuck around for that. And one guy wrote, it's funny, I was willing to die there, but I wasn't willing to live there. And I think that's actually consistent. You see a lot of these people, they're responding to this message of threat and it's over, and they actually go back to their day jobs historically. Not all of them, but most of them do. We see some of them, few of them just disappear completely, right? They don't stay involved in these networks, but some of them stay involved for decades. And some of the Spanish Civil War volunteers, and the last one just died only a couple of years ago, remained active as fundraisers. Were donating money to Marxist causes and insurgent groups in places like El Salvador in the 1980s afterwards, recruiting people to join different groups. Not a lot of them become domestic terrorists. There was a big concern about the people launching attacks. We don't see that, but we do see them becoming, the ones who stay involved become active as recruiters. And they're seen as particularly good at it. They have the connections to send people over to wherever it is. They know the right people. They have legitimacy in having done that. The ones who don't become cannon fodder, the ones who succeed and then go join other groups as career foreign fighters, they seem to rise in the ranks very quickly. We can find jihadis from the 80s and 90s who went on to join one case joined 6 different groups, The guy was not, he was from the Middle East, but he ended up leading a group in Chechnya, even though he'd never been to Russia before, because he had this legitimacy as having fought for other Al-Qaeda groups elsewhere. So there's really a Darwinian selection that comes about with these foreign fighters. That most of them, it doesn't go very well, but the ones who do, whether it's actually fighting and going and leading these groups, with some of the Al-Qaeda guys writing training manuals or going off and actually becoming instructors for some of the other groups in places like Kashmir, they actually do have a big effect if they stay involved long term. In terms of actual domestic terror attacks, there were concerns based on some studies you could see as many as 10% of returnees, and we never saw any kind of numbers like that. It's not zero. The threat with returnees is other people's research shows they do tend to radicalize. They do tend to affiliate more with the group. Some people just go as adventure seekers, but become really steeped in the ideology when they do go. There's a couple of studies in the last few years that show groups that have foreign fighters are associated more with war crimes, including not just murders, but sexual violence. Whether that's the foreign fighters or the groups is not really clear from the data, but that's the inference of these studies. So foreign fighters do seem to make battlefield conditions, worse, I guess, if you want to look at them that way, during the conflict. And there are some who become risks, upon return in different ways. Politically, it gets a little bit tricky, right? ISIS, there was nobody on ISIS's side. There's no Western country where there was a domestic constituency for ISIS or Al-Qaeda volunteers. It was very easy to say these are the bad guys. It gets a little bit more complicated when they're, let's say, an ethnic group and they haven't offended anybody, or they're perhaps members of that group, or in this case, with the Kosovo volunteers are actually members of the US Congress, or if they're on the ideological, left or right spectrum, somebody's going to have some sort of political constituency. I ran across this quote a couple of years ago, and right before the 2020 elections in the US. And again, America supported the Kosovo Liberation Army. They were fighting against Serbia in 1999. They had members of the US government who were very happy to have them do that, right? The term foreign terrorist fighter was still years away, but the idea that they're all bad, they're all crazy, that's when they're the bad guys. When they're fighting on the wrong side, what kind of fanatic would go and join this group and not get paid and travel somewhere else? If they're fighting for a cause that we like, we actually tend to think of them as the noblest heroes going out to sacrifice for themselves. If you come to Washington, D.C., right in front of the White House, or behind it, I guess technically, Lafayette Square, named after the Marquis de Lafayette, is full of statues of all kinds of foreign volunteers, who were seen as the father of the U.S. Infantry or the Navy, John Paul Jones of Scotland, or and it's not it's not just in the U.S. Did I get rid of my slide? Oh no, I got rid of my slide. There we go. It's not just in the U.S. too, where you tend to lionize foreign fighters for the right side. Tadeusz Kościuszko was actually back on my previous slide. He was a Polish volunteer who went and fought in the American Revolution on the rebel side to get experience so he could fight for Poland's independence against Russia. He built the fortifications at West Point that the U.S. Army uses for its academy. So, and of course, the highest mountain in Australia is named for him today, right? He's an international hero because there are a lot more people who like the cause of Polish independence. So, again, how we view foreign fighters, if they're not FTFs and have a law prescribing them, it can become a very politically dependent situation. So what do we do about Ukraine? Ukraine volunteers, are they going to be seen as heroes by everyone? Will they be seen as villains? Does it depend on what they do? Looking back pre-Russian invasion last year, we saw kind of a very mixed bag. The two guys at the top, I used this slide back in 2015 when I was giving talks about ISIS. The two guys are Serbian volunteers. The guy with the beard was organized volunteers from Serbia to go multiple times. He finally was arrested in Serbia for violating laws going back to the 1990s against foreign volunteers going in the Yugoslavia wars. But it was easy for me to imagine them as ISIS fighters, right, with different iconography from their holy text with the guns there. So you had people going for a variety of different causes. Some were ethnic, like the Serb volunteers going to fight on behalf of the Russian separatists. You did get a number of white supremacists, mostly from Scandinavia, going off to join the pro-Ukraine side. The one that's got the most attention, and partly it got the most attention because Russia kept flagging them for political reasons, was the Azov Battalion, right, which started out as a group that had, it wasn't expressly a white supremacist group, but it certainly did attract those elements. And Ukraine was aware of that. The Ukrainian government was aware of that, did its best to purge those elements, made Azov basically a National Guard unit of the Ukraine military so we could get greater control. That was pre-Russian invasion. And it's fully integrated into the Ukrainian military now. So yeah, any sort of panic that there are these foreign extremists going off to join Azov, that's years out of date at this point. They're not the group to watch. There are other groups to watch. There are some other private militia groups that are still in business that refuse to join the Ukrainian military. The Georgian Legion, on the bottom there, which is what the Australian neo-Nazi from Brisbane, who I showed you in one of the early slides, was the group that he joined. They're not an expressly white supremacist or neo-Nazi group either. They've had Israeli members. They've had they take far left as well. They'll take anybody they can get, but they're a group that will take anybody that they can get. So there are also people who are militarily unfit for the Ukrainian army who join groups like this as well. So what you see, and I'll give you an example of probably the biggest returnee threat. It was a U.S. citizen who's been active with Georgian Legion. They say they'll take anybody. Come join these groups because you're not going to get screened out like you would by the Ukrainian military these days. A lot of individuals who went and joined, whether it was Azov or joined Georgian Legion or others, there's another Australian who joined a group called Right Sector, far right group, who wasn't active here but became active while he was over there. They stayed. A lot of people stayed behind in Ukraine when things stabilized and there was no real open conflict after, after let's say 2016 or so. It was basically a very static situation. So some of those people stayed, they settled down, they maybe married locals, they got involved in local Ukrainian groups. So a lot of the people that Russia said, oh, look, there are foreign volunteers here, they're foreign fighters. Last year, these are people who had already lived there for several years and had actually gotten Ukrainian citizenship at that point, by the time the Russian invasion started last year. Russia did actually the same thing Mexico did in the 1830s. Russia had a policy harsher than anybody else in Western countries of saying that they're not going to recognize the rights of any foreigners. They're going to be treated as mercenaries or as pirates or something like that. Could face summary on-site executions. And there have been a number of Western citizens detained. Russia hasn't gone through with it in these cases, but threatened to execute a couple of British citizens and others, ultimately traded them back. So one guy, another case on the Russian side, showing the ideological inconsistency, is Simeon Boykov from Sydney, who some of you might be familiar with. He ran for prime minister pretty recently on the Australia First Party. He went off in 2014. He took some of the photos you see up above. He returned and he got involved with some bikie gangs that were attacking some Muslim immigrant communities. He ultimately got involved in sort of far right politics and, like I said, became a candidate for public office himself. So he's been involved in promoting. He's on social media now. He has a lot of followers. He promotes a very pro-Putin view. There are a lot of different ways that people become involved in these networks and stay involved. That can recruit people without being directly linked to illicit activities. The case that's probably gotten the most notoriety is Craig Lang, who was an American white supremacist who went off and was interested in, again, also kind of like the guy from Brisbane, was interested in fighting against Islamic State. Didn't really get that chance. He was, I think, discharged from the U.S. military. He tried to go to places like Somalia. Didn't work out for him. He ended up in Ukraine. Ultimately returned to the U.S. and got involved in extremist activity at home. He and another guy who went, military veteran who went off to Ukraine, ended up ambushing a couple in Florida. They on the premise that they were going to sell them guns, and so they just killed them and took their money and tried to use that to go fight in Venezuela, but that didn't work out. So they went back to Ukraine. Lang was in touch with an American active duty army serviceman in Kansas, who he tried to talk into blowing up media offices and political offices. And he was in touch with some of the Australian volunteers as well, talking to them about how to go off to Ukraine as well. So there are very much, some of these groups that are active. This is a case. He ended up being arraigned in Ukraine after a lot of back and forth diplomatic wrangling. Ukraine agreed to extradite him back to the U.S., but then Russia invaded, and he's now back, apparently serving very openly with a big smile on his face in the Georgian Legion again on the front lines there. So these networks are very active, and we do have cases of people coming back and being involved in one form of extremist politics or another, being involved in domestic terror plots. what we've seen is that most of the people who talked about going off to Ukraine haven't really done it. Ukraine reported 25,000 foreign volunteers after the Russian invasion. And it looks like we're probably in the low thousands for the numbers who actually even turned up, and in the hundreds for the numbers who actually deployed with the Ukrainian military unit. A lot of them that we're seeing, and it's been open, some governments, including for a while the UK, were basically telling citizens go off, no problem. We support this cause. So Ukraine has integrated them as the International Legion of Territorial Defense. As I mentioned, Azov is now just a regular military unit because they didn't want the bad publicity. And so, well, I'll talk about that in a second, but recruitment has been open. And in the US case, the Ukrainian embassy tourism webpage was used as a fill-in form. If you want to come join us, we want to hear more about your background. We want to hear about your skills. And this is, I think, a big difference, is that we actually, yes, there are neo-Nazis telling other neo-Nazis, go off and fight, get some skills, use them when you come back. But you really haven't had the same reliance on these sort of illicit networks, because you haven't had to, it's been very easy to openly enlist because of various governments supporting that. And because Ukraine has fought so much of the war in the last couple of years on social media and realizes the importance of that, just like any business today, any restaurant, bad reviews can kill them, right? So what we've seen with foreign fighters, including with ISIS, is once you go, they certainly don't let you out. That's been not the case in Ukraine. People show up, are unhappy, say, hey, I fought in Afghanistan and we had air superiority then, this is a lot less fun. Ukraine just tells them, go home. Thank you for, we appreciate your moral support. This isn't for you, that's okay. So social media has been a double-edged sword, right? There's a lot of concern about Twitter and ISIS. Now it's all on TikTok. People are just recording videos from there. Ukraine's happy to let them leave. So social media is very much a double-edged sword these days. And we've seen cases, there was actually a guy who was involved in the January 6th attacks, who active in this Boogaloo group in the US, who actually, a French journalist told me about him, and he made it there, but he didn't stay very long, right? He said, this is a trap, they're coming to get us. So we see people going home. We don't see that level of commitment. So probably the ones who stay either really believe in the cause or might find it not easy to travel back. The big concern I would have, just to wrap up with a couple of points, would be number one, alumni networks, the people like Craig Lang who do stick around for it. Might be very much, not so much like ISIS where you have waves and waves of people, but might be a little bit like what we saw in the late 1980s, early 1990s with the formation of the so-called Arab Afghans forming these networks that would become Al-Qaeda. They're really hardcore, believers in the causes, not so much that they create big organizations, which Al-Qaeda never really was, but that they keep in touch with each other and they're able to plot transnationally and share information and share best practices, which is something that foreign fighter returnees historically have done. The other thing that I would be a little bit more concerned about, and we've seen this not just from Ukraine, but we've seen this from, as I mentioned before, I've been doing some work on volunteers for the Kurdish YPG against ISIS. Not in Australia, but in a lot of other countries, there's no legal problem with doing that. And so what we've seen is a lot of people forming private security companies, PSCs, based on their experience as foreign fighters, incorporating, in some cases being recognized as NGOs legally in, let's say, in Canada or in the US. There's a group getting contracts from the Defense Department based on their previous experience in places like Syria or Myanmar. And so I think you're going to see, as a result of Ukraine, a lot more, of these unofficial entities that will exist that will not have the same standards as state militaries, that might be open to more extremists serving in them, that they're incorporating as a result of their open service in Ukraine and elsewhere. And that would be my biggest concern, in terms, not so much that individual extremists are going to go to Ukraine, get fantastic military or bomb-making experience and come back, but the fact that there are more and more doors opening for them to join, legally, to join illicit organizations and get those kind of opportunities. We've seen a couple of cases of that with people flagged as extremists joining contractors working in Ukraine rather than the Ukrainian military itself as foreign volunteers.
Great. Thank you so much, David. That was riveting. We could have gone for quite some time more. We do have some time for questions now. Who would like to begin? Don't be shy. Yes?
I didn't see a lot of any data actually from the Vietnam War or Cambodia. Are there any similarities or differences there?
Yeah, so there was some volunteering around Southeast Asia with people who are going from one communist group to another across borders. You did get people going from Laos to Cambodia, from China. You know, you'd think it would be sort of more tightly regulated under those circumstances, but there were, going back to the 1950s, you know, at least types of that volunteering. So, you know, again, I don't really track people. I have colleagues who track people who join foreign legions and things like that. I don't really do that, but just in terms of the rebel groups, sort of the illicit groups, yeah, that was happening then as well.
So while people are gathering their thoughts in the room, we do have a couple of questions that have come in from online. So one person online is saying, look, when you think about groups like Islamic State, they're proscribed as terrorist organizations. So that's easy in terms of declaring who returns from Islamic State territories or engagement as a foreign terrorist fighter. Is there any justification for or rationale for thinking about proscription in relation to conflicts like the Ukraine? And if not, why not? And would one of the consequences, this person is asking, be to offer a propaganda victory, you know, to the Russians, who, in terms of saying, look, you know, we told you they were repressive, and now they're proscribing you, you know, QED. So what are your thoughts?
So, I mean, that's a good point. I think it probably would be something that Russia would welcome as a propaganda victory. There are some countries out there who have banned their citizens from going to Ukraine. And I'm not sure about preventing them from returning once they have gone, but there are a few countries where they made it illegal to go. Yeah, I was one of those, I guess, in the minority at the time that was arguing against proscription for Syria, because to me, you know, the problem doesn't go away. I always said it was Osama bin Laden is exhibit A of what happens when you just, with Saudi Arabia stripping his citizenship and closing the doors and saying, all right, he's not a problem anymore. It really, you know, you're just putting a Band-Aid on the cancer. It metastasizes without you looking. And I think we're seeing that now with the Al-Hol camps. We have not only ISIS children, but ISIS grandchildren already at this point being raised in these camps. We have tens of thousands of them. Nobody's really sure long-term what to do about this, but it seems like a threat that's going to keep us all in business for decades now. And I think in general, the data shows us, like I said, it's not zero, but most of these people just, they come back really disaffected by their treatment there. A lot of the YPG volunteers that I've interviewed for projects recently, they still believe in the cause, but they do not believe in the organization, you know, anymore, and feel, you know, very, very cynical about it at this point. So in general, I think, yes, telling people they can't go, that's fine. Telling them they can't come back actually just creates more problems than it's worth. So I wouldn't do that with Ukraine.
Yes, I'm just thinking about both the international and domestic, you know, in Australia, the legislative regimes or the definitions you have from the United Nations. And in Australia, go back obviously to the beginning of those legislative regimes, you know, the Yugoslav conflict back then. Would you say that events have really overtaken all the legislation that we have, and it's really no longer fit for purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't, like I said, I sort of was not a fan of the Foreign Fighter Act back in 2014 when it was originally passed here. I think that, and Australia and a number of other countries are now finding on a case-by-case basis reasons to take people back. One of the issues that's come up a lot with that is sort of gendering, this idea that it's okay to take back women, to take back minors. A lot of the research shows us that with ISIS, it's the women who are more radicalized sometimes than the partners. So yeah, I think it's the implementation at this point is just problematic enough that it's probably worth going back to the drawing board with a lot of the legislation.
So let me ask you a sort of more operational question. And the example I want to give here is Musa Antonio. So I think many people in this room would be aware of him. He was a prolific recruiter for Islamic State, just a boy from my own suburb originally. He came unstuck partially because he was busy tweeting out saying, I'm here on the front line. Actually, he was shacked up in the Philippines with his paramour. And when that was exposed, it actually did not fatal damage, but quite a lot of damage. So a lot of the appeal, I'm thinking about the sort of their effectiveness as recruiters, a lot of which relies on the perception of authenticity, right? That we're the ones who have been there. We can, sort of really give you the inside scoop on what's happening on the ground. What tools do we have to interrogate and disrupt that narrative around authenticity based on I've been there?
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question. I mean, I still use some Musa Serantonio video in one of my classes. So it's funny, at the height of ISIS, he was one of the top 3 social media personalities that ISIS foreign fighters in surveys said that they followed online. It was an American, a Saudi, and an Australian, were the people who had actually gone off to ISIS were listening to, and part of that, yeah, based on this perception of authenticity. And I think also in the social media era, this is also a reason why preventing people's return doesn't really contain the biggest threat, because the ones who most of them listen to and really respect are not the ones who return, they're the ones who stay over. I think we have a lot of work that shows us that at this point that simply saying these are bad people or they may have done bad things doesn't actually dissuade anybody from following them. That's not something that's been effective with foreign fighters, or the idea that they might have been involved in war crimes or other atrocities doesn't really do it either. There's usually some sort of positive message that has to come involved as an alternative to simply saying these guys are no good. One thing, and we've seen this with a bit with ISIS, where we've seen it actually in a lot of these historical cases. Somebody's mother seems to be the only person that can stop them from actually becoming a foreign fighter, more than anything else, right? Parents guilt them out of it with this message that, all right, forget this sort of fictive kin or imaginary community that you're going to have to fight for. Your family is suffering real consequences here, and that guilt seems to snap people out of it. So that's in terms of preventing them from going. In terms of following people who've already gone, I don't have a good answer for that.
It's a tough one, isn't it? Yeah. Look, I think we probably have time for only 1 or 2 more questions. Might take the one from online to try to be fair, and then come back to you, Manas. So this person, and I'm sorry in advance to people online, we've got a ton of questions coming in, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them, unfortunately. This person is saying, what are we, is there a risk, I guess, of conflating all foreign fighters and automatically assuming that they're extremists? Yeah. In the cases where foreign fighters are not extremists, how do we draw that distinction?
Great question. I mean, how do we draw it with anybody who's involved in any kind of militant group? I think that, again, big picture data shows us that we're talking about handfuls of individuals in all of these cases who ever do anything that has them recorded as a threat after they come back, right? So I'm reluctant to categorize anybody's motive for why they go. I study why groups tell them they should go. Here's why you should come be a foreign fighter. I think it's very difficult to say why any individual actually goes and does it, whether it's for adventure or because of humanitarian reasons or because I wouldn't do that. What I would do is say that if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, you can call it a duck, and that we have people who, we have a lot of colleagues who study terrorism, and it doesn't matter if it's Northern Ireland or jihadis or domestic right-wing extremists. We say, okay, this is extremist activity, this is terrorist activity. And this is the point I was trying to make with all the different statues in Canberra and Washington. If somebody's a foreign fighter, because they've gone and fought and does basically what a foreign fighter does, whether they're good guys or on the right side or not is kind of less important than what the data shows us they're going to do. So I guess I worry less about individual motivation.
Thanks.
David, I was just going to ask, in your research, have you captured any data about, you mentioned that some of the foreign fighters were quite disillusioned. Have any of them gone on to work as formers in disengagement programs?
Not as many as you might think as with extremists. I'm actually working on a couple of studies with one guy who was a YPG fighter and was interviewing some of his colleagues for me. I guess he's worked with a couple of groups in Europe, so I guess he would be the one I know of. I've heard of 1 or 2 who've gone with ISIS. I did meet one guy in Indonesia who was in Afghanistan in the 80s who was doing PVECV work. So yeah, I mean, there are, I guess, a couple of them out there, but I was making the argument that, during the ISIS sort of heyday, that this would actually be a fantastic resource because people who've gone have the legitimacy, right? And can tell the story. This is what it's really like there. And you know, I think, I don't know, maybe even make that a condition to return, right? That we're going to enlist you. All right, you know. So I would recommend doing that, but I don't think it's happening much.
The final question that we have time for comes from online. This is really about, you know, how you see the issues in relation to who is vulnerable to recruitment. So the person asking this question is making the point that, look, there are a number of Africans who are actually becoming foreign fighters in other countries for economic benefit. It's not about the ideology. They then are also, besides the economic benefit, if they return to their home countries where there might well be a civil conflict, they have increased capability, capacity, perhaps intent, and so forth. So how do how do we address the question of who might be more or less vulnerable to recruitment on some of those key indicators?
Yeah, I think that's very situational. I wish I had a good answer for that. If you go back and look at the historical cases, you find people who are, you know, royalty. You find people who, in a number of countries, are going and becoming foreign fighters. Very wealthy families. I would say, on the whole, they tend to be people who are involved in, very active in sub-communities, but are not maybe tied into the broader civil society, have expressed some sort of experience of discrimination, maybe under national citizenship. You know, just like terrorism, nobody can give you a profile. We can talk about processes through which people radicalize. Nobody can give you a profile of who, you know, really is going to become a terrorist. I would say the same about foreign fighting. I'll throw one more acronym out. We talked about foreign fighters. We talked about FTFs. The World Bank created a term called combatants on foreign soil, COFs, back in the 2000s to talk about some of these African fighters, mostly around the Great Lakes region. And yeah, a lot of them seemed to be doing it for economic benefit. Although there was one guy who said he was fought in 6 different groups and he believed in all their ideologies very, very deeply. That's right. He was right. So the solution there was basically DDR programs, basically to get people demobilized, disengage, to reintegrate, maybe by giving them a little bit of money to help reestablish farms. And I did some digging. The data really isn't there to support the bold claims that it worked so well.
You have to say, watch this space in terms of your final slide on the way in which becoming a foreign fighter or a foreign combatant is now becoming corporatized. It's become an industry.
Yes.
And with private security companies, you know, gaining more and more traction, perhaps we're only going to see a bit more of this.
Incentives for that. Yeah.
Okay, I wish we could continue. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Could you please join me in thanking David? Thank you also to everybody who joined us online, and hope to see you for the next AVERT webinar. Can I also just give a plug? We are holding our usual annual AVERT International Research Symposium this year from the 26th to the 28th of September, again here at Beacon Downtown. The theme this year for the symposium is Democracy, Dissent, and Countering Violent Extremism, trying to take hold of some of those complex issues in the landscape that we know that we're now dealing with in a very volatile set of circumstances around extremism and also around threats to democracy. So we really, really hope that we see you there and that you register and come along for that. Thanks again.